Today, I'm Jamie Fly. I'm the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, a small think tank in Washington. We're very pleased to co-host this event today on the future of U.S.-Russian relations with the Institute of Modern Russia. We know that during this election year, there's not a whole lot of attention being paid to foreign policy, unfortunately in the eyes of some of us, but we do think that there are a number of important issues that should be discussed, and so we're very pleased to have a great panel to discuss U.S.-Russian relations today. I know many of you probably saw in our original announcement that Ambassador John Bolton was going to join us. Unfortunately, he was called over to the convention at the last minute today, but we were able to quickly get several replacements for him. We're very qualified to talk about the Romney campaign's views on these issues. We have joining us Ambassador Richard Williamson, as well as Ambassador Pierre Prosper, to fill in for Ambassador Bolton. So I think we'll have a good discussion. Maybe I'm going to start off by just introducing each of our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them to deliver some brief remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions and answer after that. I already mentioned Ambassador Richard Williamson. He's a foreign policy advisor on Governor Romney's campaign and has served in a variety of national security positions in the administrations of 3 U.S. presidents. He served as Assistant President of Governmental Affairs from 1981 to 1983, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Office in Vienna from 1988 to 1989. And I think, as I mentioned, he's a great person to give some insights into what a future U.S.-Russia policy might look like in a new administration. Ambassador Prosper, to his left, is also on the Romney campaign and served in the George W. Bush administration as the U.S. Ambassador at Large in charge of the Secretary of State's Office of War Crimes issues. To his left, we have Pavel Khodorkovsky, who's basically the driving force behind this event today with his role at the Institute of Modern Russia. He's the president of the Institute. It's an organization he founded to continue the work of his father, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who began that work at the Open Russia Foundation, and Pavel's picked that up since his father's arrest in 2003, an issue I think we'll talk about a bit today. And finally, we have Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's a member of the Federal Council of the Republican Party of Russia People's Freedom Party, and also part of the Solidarity Movement. We've done a lot of work with him in Washington over the last 3.5 years, and with the Solidarity Movement, helping them and some of their leaders like Garry Kasparov and Boris Nemtsov air their concerns about the current Russian government to a D.C. audience and people in the administration on Capitol Hill. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Ambassador Williamson just to give us some initial thoughts about what a Romney policy on Russia might look like if Governor Romney is elected president, and then we'll just move down the line. It's up to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here in Tampa for the nomination of the next President of the United States. First, I have to thank the Foreign Policy Institute for all the good work it does. I'm a little intimidated because Steve Beacon's here, who knows more about Russia than I, so I'll try to be careful and not embarrass myself. But let me just first back up. Barack Obama's foreign policy is out of the mainstream, bipartisan mainstream foreign policy since World War II. Truman, Kennedy, Reagan all believed in peace through strength and in American leadership. The two outliers were President Jimmy Carter and President Barack Obama, who feel engagement for engagement's sake results in a safer world. Well, it hasn't been that way for the last 3.5 years. Governor Romney believes, first, in American exceptionalism, which means not, as he said in his Citadel speech, just that America has the greatest military might, which we do, though it must be rebuilt. Not just that America has the largest economy, which we do, but must be rebuilt. Not that we have a cultural reach that's unparalleled, which we do, but because we were the first country founded on the principles of human rights, democracy, liberty. And it's those values that have animated America for over 200 years. And it's those values that Ronald Reagan used to refer to as a shining city on the hill. In contrast, Barack Obama, in his first trip to Europe, was asked about American exceptionalism, and he said, sure, I believe it, the same way the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism and the British believe in British exceptionalism. So that's the first fundamental difference, and first difference in how they approach foreign policy. Mitt Romney believes and understands and appreciates and embraces American exceptionalism. Secondly, he believes that America is better off when America leads. Not lead from behind, whatever the heck that means, but leads. And not only is America better off, but our friends and allies are better off, and the world is better off. And third, he believes in peace through strength. America's never gotten into a war because we're too strong. And we have seen under this administration an innovation of our defenses, and based on the way President Obama is playing politics with the tax issue, a willingness for sequestration, which even Secretary Panetta says would be devastating to our national defense. Those are three fundamentally different approaches to foreign policy than Barack Obama. Then fourth, that we should be friends with our friends. Our strength has come from allies who we've had shared values with, shared vision. This administration has frayed our relationships not only with the Atlantic Alliance, but other friends around the world, where they question our leadership. This administration, as David Sanger pointed out, wants to have risk avoidance. The trouble with risk avoidance and failure to lead is you cross your fingers, hold your breath, and hope things work out. And that hasn't done so well in Syria, where 17,000 people have died. And it hasn't worked out so well with Iran, that is much closer to nuclear breakout today than it was when Barack Obama came to office. Because the fact is, if you want to be passive, you want to lead from behind, you want to avoid leadership, you want to avoid risk, you're going to end up with greater risk, and tougher options, and having to take more muscular acts. So those are fundamental principles that are different between Barack Obama and Governor Romney. He's been consistent on it. He's been embraced that worldview in his Citadel speech, in his VFW speech, and his answers to questions. What's that mean with Russia? With Russia, he understands we have to reset the failed reset policy. Let's look at the list. Russia continues its illegal occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. How can an American administration be in office this long and not be publicly raising that illegal occupation that came from an illegal invasion? Because of a false view of engagement. Ken Lieberthal's a China specialist, a Democrat, used to be at the University of Michigan. A friend of mine was head of China policy at the NSC for Clinton, one of three authors of a book, Bending History, by three Democrats that's generally favorable from Obama. But at the end of his second page about Obama's approach to China, he said the following. Barack Obama, the president, believed his ideas and his eloquence would bend China's behavior. China found that curious. and look to their interests. Countries look to their interests. And we have differences, even with our friends, let alone those who strategically have such a challenge to our interest like Musk. But what has he sacrificed in the hope for engagement that's given us so little? And I'll allow my good friend Pierre to talk about the sacrifice of values that should be animating our foreign policy. But let's look. The illegal occupation of Abkhazia and Ossetia. The use of energy as a weapon to intimidate the Baltics, Ukraine, and other Eastern Europeans. A policy that has not been helpful in the six-party talks with North Korea. A policy that has helped Iran advance its nuclear program, and where it has not been useful in the UN to put further pressure on Iran. And I will point out, by the way, the Bush administration had 3 resolutions on Iran calling for suspension of enrichment, and the current administration has got them. But my point is Russia has not embraced the same values. They've opposed us on missile defense. And all the while, and of course in Syria, they are trying to prop up their last ally in the Middle East. And let's just look at that, because it's very illuminating about the U.S. with Russia and the current administration's policy in dealing with foreign policy challenges or foreign affairs. For my sins, I've been ambassador to the UN for the U.S. in Vienna, Geneva, New York, more than any other American in our history, and hopefully that will limit my years in purgatory. Anyone who's worked the UN can tell you that Russia is going to try to prop up Bashir al-Assad. It just is going to. For all the reasons I mentioned, including the money, including the fact that it's the one port to the Mediterranean. So you're not going to get meaningful action out of the Security Council. There's only 3 possible options. 1, veto of anything that would meaningfully put pressure on Bashir al-Assad. 2, pass a resolution after it no longer means anything, after the guy's gone. Or 3, support a resolution that's so weak it won't have any impact. That's the only 3 options. Yet, the administration points to the Security Council on why we can't pursue our own interests. Even CENTCOM commander said the greatest damage to Tehran would come if Assad fell. It's important for Iran with respect to rearming Hezbollah. It's important to Iran with respect to being its friend, Persian Iran, in the Arab world. It's important to Russia for the reasons I mentioned. We have strategic interests there. But we've said, oh, no, we won't work with the Security Council. That's posture without policy. It's activity without action. They knew it. And all they wanted to do is divert attention from the American people, divert attention from responsibility while people die. In March last year, 16 months ago, Al Khatib, 13-year-old, 12-year-old, was at demonstration. He was arrested. Nobody knew where he was. 2 weeks later, he's returned to his home. He's wrapped in plastic. And under the plastic, he's wrapped in a rug. And under the rug is a mutilated bird body that has been decomposing for 4 weeks, with his penis cut off and stuck in his mouth. You know, even if you're a slow learner, you should have understood Bashir al-Assad wasn't going to leave because Kofi Annan said nice things. Yet this administration allowed Russia to determine what we could do in our cell phones, allowed innocents to die. And I won't go, this isn't the topic, but note the only country in the Arab awakening that has a non-Islamist president today and a non-Islamist majority in its parliament is the one country with the U.S. help lead, and that's Libya. So Russia does all these things. The European observers say last March the election wasn't free and fair. The cost, it took President Obama 48 hours to call Putin to congratulate. And so what has Putin done? He's introduced and passed laws that further squeeze civil society, increase costs for penalties, crowds out political opposition, and we're all still waiting for any comment of significance from what was once the Office of the Legal Retriever. The Mike incident with Barack Obama cannot be overstated. It tells you more about this Chicago politician than anything reported day to day. When he said, Medvedev, this is my last election, give me space, I'll have more flexibility after the election. What was he saying? I'm going to lie to the American people about what I want to do. He's saying, I'm going to do deals with Russia, notwithstanding all the things you're doing. It says, I am willing to bend our interest to try to accommodate you. And that was heard more in Tehran than it seems to have been heard in the United States. Because Tehran's pretty confident that they won't eventually end up with a deal of 3.5% enrichment. They'll end up with a deal with 5% enrichment. Because when they discovered the 20% enriched uranium, the administration said nothing. So we've now had 4 discussions where nothing's been accomplished. It's a placeholder only to get past the election. Everybody understands that. All the time, Iran's doing more centrifuge enrichment, getting closer to nuclear breakout. And what do? Our friend, our ally of shared values, facing an existential threat. This administration, in every public statement, tries to make it harder for them to take the action they need to take to protect their lives. Under Mitt Romney, he will work with our friends and allies networks. He will rebuild those bridges. He will make it so our friends and allies, including Israel, have a political partnership. So we will work together on those difficult decisions, whatever is necessary. Russia. Russia is a stool with one leg in its resource extraction. Their geographic footprint make them critical to important issues that impact U.S. interest and vital security. The policy of accommodation, engagement, and get out of jail free passes for their misbehavior have not helped us on any of those issues that go to our values, our interests, our security. It's time to change.
Thank you. Well, thank you, FPI, for inviting me to be part of this. This is a very important topic. the U.S. relations with Russia and what the future should be. Richard and I, as you know, were last-minute substitutions. I think John Bolton would be pleased to hear it gets too. To fill his shoes here. We did not have the opportunity to really coordinate our remarks. Ambassador Williamson is able to give you a good overview. So therefore, I'll be briefer in what I have to say. But there are a couple of things that I do want to focus on. And the first is to open with a question. When is the last time we saw Russia on the right side of peace? When is the last time we saw Russia on the right side of human rights, of humanity? Really? I mean, think about every conflict that we've seen over the past several decades. Which side has Russia been on? Have they been fighting for humanity? Has Russia fought for justice? It should give us an idea of what kind of partner that nation is or can be. So that is why when we start looking at this question of reset, look at the question of, well, let's give Russia and perhaps we'll get something in return. It is a naive policy. Because Russia doesn't give, they take. And we have seen this happen during the course of the last 4 years. Missile defense. Obama gives. He says we won't put the missiles in Poland or the Czech Republic. What do we get? Nothing. Issues of democracy. We go a little softer. The Obama administration is not going to aggressively pursue the human rights bill. We support human rights bill. What happens? Nothing. We know that there were elections that have been called into question. And what happens? More arrests. More use of the court system as a weapon rather than an instrument of justice. So this tells you what kind of partner that you're dealing with. Russia is aggressive and it's being expansive or expansionist. Rich talked about this. We know about what happened in Georgia. We know how they use energy as a weapon to get the surrounding states to follow their policy, to stay in line, to be quiet. We have seen what happens in Iran and Syria. And again, we've seen what's happening at home with these arrests and the faulty elections. So we need to, when we have a policy with Russia, the United States needs to be firm. The United States needs to understand the type of partner or country it is dealing with. When it comes to the issues in the United Nations, sure you can give it a try. Say, okay, what can we do in the Security Council? But if it seems as though it's going to fail in a place like Iran, in a place like Syria, the United States needs to get out and go to other willing parties in order to achieve justice or the right solution. Rich, you put the number at 17,000. I hear 19,000. Numbers are ever growing in Syria. As we speak, someone is dying because of inaction. And part of that is because of Russia, because we've allowed Russia to dictate the policy on Syria. That has allowed those deaths, those massacres, the torture to occur. Rather than being out in front and showing leadership, building a coalition of people, that people are willing to take action, going to the surrounding countries and pressuring people to say, look, we've got to take action. We need to take aggressive measures to save lives. I'm reminded of the president's statement on Libya, where he said, I cannot sit back and be a bystander and watch slaughter or massacres occur. I'm paraphrasing. But that's exactly what he's doing here. That's exactly what is happening. He's not true to his own words. So what we will see with Governor Romney in particular as it deals with Russia is that he has a clear understanding of the nature of the government. He has a clear understanding that this government is about power. He has a clear understanding that it will be aggressive to its neighbors and that it will be supporting other authoritarian regimes. So what we need to be doing, what he believes, is we need to build our relationships with the Eastern European and Central Asian countries. We need to fortify them with military relationships, diplomatic relationships, economic, through energy, support them with energy so they can have that independence, that freedom from Russia. We need to begin to bring more people here, as we have here today, that can be part of this democratic movement, that can understand, that can be the voice of the future for Russia. We saw this in the Cold War where you start getting your ideas out there. You cannot underestimate or undervalue the concept of promoting democracy. Democracy sticks. You know, when people understand it, they want it. There's a thirst for it. My parents, my family's from Haiti. And I'll never forget the story my father told me. I was born here, we moved back to Haiti. And I lived there until I was approaching 6 years old. Years later, and then we moved back to the United States. I asked my father, I said, well, Pop, why did we move back? You know, why did we come to the United States? You know, it's an interesting question. And what he said to me was, at that time Haiti was something which still is today, but had its problems back then. He said, Pierre, once you taste freedom, you can't live without it. So what we need to do, and what the governor believes in, is we need to provide that taste of freedom. We need to speak loudly about the American ideals, American values. We should not be shy in speaking about democracy or human rights. These are important principles. Because if you have a nation that respects human rights, if you have a nation that respects democracy, they are someone you can do business with. They are someone you can rely upon when you approach them with a problem and say 19,000 people have been massacred. If a nation is not even true to its own people, how will it be true to the rest of the world? Russia is not true to its own people. And I know we're going to hear stories of the crack on democracy, human rights. But just keep that in mind, and keep in mind my opening question. When was the last time Russia was on the right side of humanity? That should tell you, or inform you as you formulate the policy. Thank you very much.
I'll also add, if anyone who's standing wants to grab a seat, they're
My name is Paul Grigowski. I'm the president of the Institute for Russia. And the future of Russia, how it develops into a modern democracy, and its relationship with the United States are matters that have extreme importance and value. Thank you. My father, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, as you may know, was arrested almost 9 years ago for taking the very actions needed to usher a new age in Russia. Creating civic institutions, speaking out about corruption, supporting a movement that opposed single-party rule. Those actions ultimately landed in the memoirs, because it was not something that the Russian government at the time was wanting. But from the time Putin took power on December 31st, 1999, until very recently, Russia has stagnated. Tens of thousands of young people, highly educated people that leave the country each year to look for opportunities elsewhere. The Russian stock market is flat. Businesses and entrepreneurs are reluctant to invest.
Pablo, lean right into the mic.
Sure.
All the way in.
Businesses and entrepreneurs are reluctant to invest there due to fear of retribution should they run afoul of the current regime, or because they cannot afford to pay the bribes. The corrupt bureaucracy is literally harassing and squeezing every single ounce of willpower that's required to run your business successfully. That's why many of my friends who have studied with me in the U.S. went back to Russia to run their business are now returning back to the U.S. Economic analysts world over say that as long as my father remains in prison, doing business in Russia will be a dangerous and frankly untenable proposition. But I believe this can change very soon. And that's why we're here today, because we're going to need the help of freedom-loving people, especially Americans, to succeed. Ever since Putin stole both the parliamentary and the presidential elections a few months ago, more and more of my countrymen have become fed up with the lies and the repression, and they've begun to organize in numbers never before seen on the streets of modern-day Russia. This momentum is carrying on today and growing. For example, literally today, a young mother whose only crime was that she was the wife of a political activist, Taisia Osipova, was handed down a horrible sentence, 8 years, double what the prosecutors have asked for in her case. You may have heard the story of a female punk rock band who have recently received an unjust sentence after a politically motivated trial. As thousands of Russians took to the streets to voice their concern and protect the rights of those unjustly imprisoned people, hundreds more joined them around the globe in cities like New York, London, DC, and Paris. I should say that the Republicans have always been pioneers in human rights, and their unwavering support of the Magnitsky Bill is a prime example of that. The Republican Party, the party that recognizes America's role as the world beacon of democracy, even in time when fostering that freedom proves a very challenging task. The U.S. relations with Russia have become consistently more strained since Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, followed by the return of Vladimir Putin, who is an authoritative leader with little regard for human rights and democracy. These factors have made the task of associating with Russia that much more difficult. And frankly, it's gotten to a point where resetting the relationships with Russia will no longer mitigate the situation, as long as Russia's current leadership remains in power. Governor Romney has rightfully accused Putin of reversing democratic gains and liberties in Russia, stating that it is unfortunate that the desire to be free is met with brutal opposition in Russia, where once promising advances towards a free and open society have faltered. It is often more unfortunate that concerns for human rights and the value of individual lives have decreased to a particularly non-existent level in Russia, where an opinion or approach that does not coincide with Putin's is censored and is excessively punished with an underlying goal of deterrence. It is a core belief of the Institute of Modern Russia that American foreign policy should be grounded on support of democratic values in Russia. This is why the Republican Party needs to embrace Putin's opposition that is growing in number. As more and more individuals become dissatisfied with his oppressive regime. Never before in modern history have the values of Russian society been further away from the values of the government that's leading the country. Russia is a nation that is rich in resources, hardworking people, and innumerable investment opportunities. However, Putin's undiplomatic treatment of Russia's entrepreneurs has discouraged anyone considering making an investment in my country. By harming or discouraging people who are willing to invest in Russia's prosperity, various opportunities for all involved are being closed off. What Putin doesn't understand is that this type of regime is eroding the foundation of democracy. By harming the growing opposition movement, which now includes many of Russia's elite, Putin is literally, and I agree with you, is putting our country on the wrong side of history. The opposition's wishes for Russia are aligned with those of the United States. They want Russia to be a dictatorship-free, democratic state that provides its citizens with an opportunity for growth and is able to make Russia into a reliable partner abroad. The Republicans are correct in their stance of not supporting Putin's administration, and there is a part of the Russian population that agrees with this approach wholeheartedly. It is imperative that the Republican Party continues in its role as a leader in support of human rights and make its efforts to aid the Russian opposition movement by recognizing that their interests are indeed aligned. Republicans do have colleagues in Russia, colleagues that would greatly appreciate their support. The last time I saw my father in September of 2003, literally 1 month before his arrest. He was visiting me at Williamson College in Boston, here in the United States. We talked about each other's prospects for the next couple of years, about me trying to establish myself in business, and about him trying to move out of business and into philanthropy. He was 40 at that time. He set the goal for himself that by the time he's going to be 45, he will move completely into a new phase of his life, investing in education and building up the missing blocks of democracy in Russia. Civil society, free press, and multiple opposition parties. As I have mentioned, this is ultimately what has landed him in jail. Russian authorities have been stepping up the pressure on his colleagues, and by the time he returned back in October, he got arrested on October 25th. Was his partner and close friend, Platon Lebedev, already in jail. He did say that he was prepared for the arrest and yet returned back home knowing what's in store. But he made that decision understanding that ultimately he cannot sacrifice his values and enjoy life outside of Russia when the country is continuously deteriorating. He decided to take that stance and has been punished for his decision for 9 years. He hasn't given up fighting, though, for a more just Russia. Even inside his jail cell, he is participating in the building of a new, free society by publishing his thoughts, by engaging in dialogue with other leaders of opinion in Russia. And this is a fight for democratic Russia with values that embrace the same democratic values, the Russian interpretation of these values that we need the U.S. to help us take up. From the major cities across the country to the halls of Congress. We're looking for the next occupant of the White House to lead that fight, to call on Putin to let my father out of prison, and to compel Putin to end his support of the world's most rogue regimes, and ultimately to allow the free elections that need to take place in Russia. Thank you.
Our final speaker, as I introduced before, is Vladimir Kara-Murza. One thing I forgot to mention about Vladimir, he was the bureau chief of the Russian television station RTVI in Washington for 8 years, until this year when he was dismissed and then blacklisted from Russian media because of his very vocal support for the Magnitsky Act, which many of you have heard about, which I believe, I haven't seen the final version, but I believe the Republican platform actually expresses the Republican Party's support for passing the Magnitsky Act. And FPI should have done a lot of work on that as well. So, Vladimir?
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you to my fellow panelists, and especially thanks to the Front Voice Initiative and the Institute of Modern Russia for organizing and co-hosting this very important and timely event. On the 5th of March, the day after Vladimir Putin declared his victory in the so-called presidential elections, thousands of Muscovites gathered on Pushkin Square, a historic place, the site of the first dissident demonstration in 1965, just down the street from the Kremlin, to protest against election fraud and against Putin's authoritarian rule. I remember well standing with my colleagues, my opposition colleagues on the speaker's platform in front of the rally and seeing before us just a sea of faces and of flags and of posters from very different movements, political parties, from left to right, all united by common rejection of a repressive and corrupt regime which has ruled our country for 12 years and which has indicated recently wants to have a go for another 12. I haven't seen Moscow as it was in March, perhaps since the crisis in '93. It looked like a city under military occupation. All the central streets, squares, and the entire perimeter around the Kremlin were literally occupied by thousands of special police forces, interior ministry troops, the elite Zhinsky division, even special forces from Chechnya were brought into Moscow to protect Mr. Putin's fraudulent victory. I remember walking down up Pushkin from Pushkin Square to the Kremlin and being literally in amazement at what it looked like, maybe the city looked like. And whatever it looked like, it certainly didn't look like the behavior of a legitimate winner of a legitimate election. On the very same day, on March the 5th, the United States State Department has issued its official statement. I quote, "The United States congratulates the Russian people on the completion of the presidential elections and looks forward to working with the president-elect." End of quote. And just a few days later, as it was already mentioned, the White House announced, and I quote again, "President Obama has called Russian President-elect and Prime Minister Putin to congratulate him on his recent victory in the Russian presidential election." End quote. That readout listed several topics discussed by the two leaders, but there was not a single mention of anything related to democracy, human rights, or electoral fraud. Now, nobody disputes the need for democratic countries to cooperate with non-democratic regimes on specific international issues. But I can tell you that congratulation was taken by many people in Russia as at best a mockery and at worst an insult. Because this was, of course, an election in which the only genuine pro-democracy challenger, Yablonsky, had been removed prior to the ban, in which the television coverage was overwhelmingly skewed in favor of one candidate, and in which, despite all of that, millions of votes were stolen during the actual voting and the vote count on the 4th of March through the usual tricks like carousel votes, ballot stuffing, rigging the final protocols, and so on and so forth. I think the official observation mission of the OSCE summed it up best, and this is a quote from the statement: "There was no real competition, and the abuse of government resources ensured that the ultimate winner of the election was never in doubt." End of quote. There does not seem in this much cause for congratulations. Now, of course, this is not the first instance when the U.S. administration, of either party, closed their eyes on such inconvenient issues as human rights and democracy in favor of realpolitik or pragmatic foreign policy. But I would argue that in the case of Putin, this is not only immoral, but also impractical. Because in the last several months, as Pavel has already mentioned, Russia has changed beyond recognition. And I mean, of course, not the regime, but the nation and the society. And I just want to, just a quick note, sure, I know people in the West often, maybe it's a language thing, often interchange Russia and the Putin regime, and for us it's very important that these things are obviously not one and the same. because in the last few months, since the end of last year, tens of thousands of Russians have been coming out to the streets and squares of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other large cities to protest against Putin's repressive rule and to demand free elections and democratic reforms. The largest such rally on Andrei Sakharov Avenue at the end of December drew more than 120,000 people. This was the largest pro-democracy rally, indeed the largest rally of any kind since the 91 anti-communist revolution which toppled the Soviet regime. The backbone of these protests have been and continue to be Russia's growing middle class, mostly young, mostly urban, mostly educated, people who have achieved a certain degree of economic stability and well-being, and who now demand the rule of law, and political dignity and political rights. They want to be treated as citizens in their own country and not be told who's going to rule over them for the next 6 or 12 years. We are not cattle was one of the most popular slogans in December and February and May and June protests in central Moscow. Now this movement is not subsiding. Despite the partial, largely cosmetic political concessions that struck at the end of last year for the legalization of opposition parties and the reinstatement of direct gubernatorial elections, which, although did represent the first political retreat by the Putin regime in its 12 years in power, it didn't fundamentally change the nature of the regime. And more importantly, the movement is not subsiding in the face of an increased crackdown. And the crackdown has been much more substantial than the so-called concessions. In May, during Putin's inauguration, more than 1,000 people were arrested during the 2 days of protest against his inauguration. The treatment of protesters was very much like Mr. Lukashenko usually treats protesters in neighboring Belarus. Riot police was used, pepper spray, batons. About 50 protesters were injured by riot police, and apparently this wasn't enough for the Kremlin because Mr. Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, said that he thought the protesters' livers should have been spread across the pavement. That's a direct quotation. And then, of course, in June, Mr. Putin hastily signed the new law on public rallies, which raised the fines for so-called violations of street protests by 150 times, making the maximum individual fine setting it at $9,000, which is 10 times the average monthly salary of the Russian Federation today. And just a day before the planned protest in June, police and prosecutors conducted early morning raids on the homes of leading opposition figures in a clear attempt to scare off protesters, presumably. But whatever they tried to do, it didn't work because in June, on Russia's National Day, between 50 and 100,000 people marched through the streets and the boulevards of central Moscow in defiance of Putin's regime. Public opinion seems to be going clearly in favor of the protesters. The July poll by the Levada Center showed that 42% of the general population of Russia, not the cities, not the middle class, the general population, is now backing the aims of the anti-Putin protesters. Whereas Putin's favorability ratings have fallen from 80% 4 years ago to 48% today, the same Levada Center poll. And this, I should add, is in the context of total government control of all the major national media outlets and television stations. Even by the official statistics of the March 4th presidential election, Putin has lost the majority support in Moscow, he's lost it in Vladivostok, he's lost it in Kaliningrad, he's lost it in Omsk, he's lost it in other large towns and cities across the country. By the official government statistics, you can only guess what the real results will be if there may be a free election. Just under a year ago in September, when Putin and Medvedev announced their initial job swap, many analysts were asking the question about how long this regime was being prolonged. Was it until 2024, or 2030, or 2036? I think today many more people are beginning to wonder whether Putin will actually be able to complete his 6-year term, which officially ends in 2018. And in fact, recently the Center for Strategic Research, which is a pro-Putin think tank in Moscow, set up and run by Putin's close associates, published a report, sort of a forecast for the next few years, which predicted the accelerating political crisis, the spread of the protest movement outside of the large cities and into the provinces, and eventually early elections around 2015, which, in the center's view, will likely be won by the Russian opposition. So one of the questions of this forum today is, what can the US and free world do and how the US can help? I think to state the obvious, the task of bringing democracy back to Russia, holding free elections, achieving transition from authoritarianism to a free political system is a task only for ourselves, for Russians, and not for any outside players. But I think the United States can show that it is serious about the declared commitment to such values as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The first and the most obvious thing, I think, is just to call things for what they are and to be honest publicly. That does help a great deal. But the second and the most practical and the most immediate measure for which we don't even need to wait for the November elections is what Pavel also mentioned. In 10 days from now, the US Congress will return briefly for its September session. And one of the likely items on the agenda will be the Serbia-Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. Unusually for today's Washington, a broadly bipartisan measure. Its dozens of sponsors from both houses range from the most liberal Democrats to the most conservative Republicans. In fact, the lead sponsors in both houses, Senator Cardin and Congressman McGovern, are Democrats, which did not stop the Obama White House from opposing this bill both in public and in private from the very beginning. Now, the bill is based on a very simple idea that human rights violators have names. The bill proposes to introduce targeted visa sanctions and targeted asset freezes against Russian officials who engage in corruption and in violation of internationally recognized human rights, such as the right to fair trial, the right to democratic elections, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, freedom of religion. It's directed primarily at those in the present ruling establishment in Moscow who like to rule and to govern in the style of Zimbabwe or Venezuela or Iran, but themselves like to go skiing in France or doing their Christmas shopping in New York City and parking their money and their children in the West. The only way to influence the behavior of such people is to introduce a measure of personal accountability to those who continue to violate the rights and freedoms of Russian citizens on a daily basis. The Republican leader of the House, Eric Cantor, promised that this question will be on the agenda in September. And I know I speak not just for myself, but for many of my colleagues in the Russian opposition when I expressed hope that this bill will be, in fact, on the agenda, will be considered, and will be passed. And the Russian opposition fully supports the exchange, which would consist in repealing the outdated Jackson-Vanik provision, which is no longer relevant, and which maintains sanctions against an entire country, which are not warranted, and instead introducing those targeted personal sanctions against human rights violators and corrupt officials, which are more than relevant today. And I think from the Kremlin's hysterical reaction, we see most clearly that this does hit the mark, and their reaction shows that this is precisely spot on, and we do hope that it's passed as soon as possible. And so finally, in the medium to long-term future, I think that most of the tensions and conflicts between the US and Russia in the past few years, be it Georgia or Syria, stem from the nature and the actions of the undemocratic regime in the Kremlin. History has shown many times the clear link between an internally repressive policy and aggressive behavior on the world stage. This regime has made anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism in general one of its ideological pillars, as well as one of its tactical tools. Objectively speaking, I do not think that there are any real reasons for Russia and America in the 21st century to be antagonists. Most of the challenges that we face are common to both of us, be potentially nuclear Iran, which is as much or perhaps more of a danger to Russia than to the United States, to the increasingly ambitious and resurgent communist China, which is clearly not a danger to Russia than it is to the United States, just geographically. And in fact, there was a recent poll done by the Levada Center which showed that despite the massive propaganda by the regime for several years, an overall majority of Russians still have a favorable opinion towards the United States. So I think in the medium to long term we can fully expect, and we should expect, and we should look forward to the United States and a democratic Russia to establish a reliable, fully fledged, and mutually beneficial partnership. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Vladimir. We got underway a little bit late, but we are running very late now, so maybe I'll just open it up for about 2 questions. I'll just then ask the panelists to respond and make some final remarks, and then we'll let you all enjoy the reception. So, do we have any questions? And if you could just state your name and affiliation. And if you could just stand up and maybe speak up, we don't have a voting.
Hi, Hope Hodge, Human Events. This question is for Ambassador Williamson, particularly in his role as Omni advisor at this point. And I was wondering 2 things. First of all, the governor's earlier comment about Russia being our #1 geopolitical foe. I was wondering if you could kind of put that in context for me, if you said what he meant to say there, and where he was coming from on that, first of all. And second, I've taken a look at the new Republican platform, and there is a good portion of that on Russia. And I was wondering, kind of the size of the concern of our relations with Russia in relation to perhaps other nations. I'm not phrasing this well, but basically, Russia's a big portion of the platform. I was hoping you could address that.
We'll collect one more and then we'll respond. Is there another question?
I was wondering what panelists thought the new presidency could actually do to open up economic development in Russia in terms of globalization and more transparency.
Again, I want to add a third then for the panel, or actually two parts for our American speakers. I know one thing that the Foreign Policy Initiative often finds when we're out there making a case for more of a frank dialogue between Washington and Moscow on these issues, you're quickly called a Cold Warrior, that you just want to return to some sort of Cold War with Russia. How do you respond to that, given Governor Romney's views, and how do you deal with those who just accuse you of having a mindset that's set several decades ago? And then for our Russian speakers, I think you both spoke very eloquently about what America could do, but how do you respond to those who also kind of defend the current administration by saying that